Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to the Institute of Aquaculture's Big Fish series seminar. And today we're on impacts of COVID-19 on seafood value chains. Before we start, and while we wait for others to join, can I invite you to interact with us, please, by using the questions box. Our panelists will do their best to address these questions in real time, and we'll also have time later on in the seminar to follow up on key issues arising with the panel. Thank you. My name is Dave Little, and I'm at the Institute of Aquaculture, the University of Stirling, and I'll be hosting today's event. Today, our panel will explore the impacts of COVID-19 on seafood value chains from both local and international perspectives. We start with a short video in which Dave Love gives you an overview based on a recent paper that he led. We then hear brief perspectives and opinions from voices around the world from those whose lives are dependent on seafood.
Hi, this is Dave Love. I'm a researcher at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. I'll be speaking today about COVID-19 impacts, responses, and lessons for building resilience in the seafood system. This talk is based on a paper that covers the first 5 months of the pandemic and is accepted in the journal Global Food Security. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank a very special team of co-authors who helped me in this process. And a lot of the ideas that come out in today's talk have been ones that we have been discussing over the past many months. Why talk about COVID and seafood? First, seafood is important for food and nutrition security for people all around the world. If you look at the map, the countries marked in yellow show where seafood makes up more than 20% of animal protein supply. Second, the seafood sector provides employment and livelihoods for many, many people. Half of fisheries catch and 90% of fisheries employment comes from the small-scale sector, living in the global south, and these people may not be receiving pandemic aid funds from governments or banks. Third, seafood is the most widely traded food commodity by value and can teach us lessons about how the food system responds to pandemics. The COVID-19 pandemic is one of many shocks the seafood sector has faced, and this slide is just to give you some perspective about that. Rich Cottrell and colleagues have shown in these figures that the leading causes of shocks to the seafood sector are due to climate change, extreme weather events, mismanagement of resources, or policy changes, and that some places around the world are more prone to shocks than others. Jessica Gebhardt and colleagues have shown that most food system shocks are at the production level. But what's different about this pandemic is that it affects production, consumption, and has networked effects through trade, which we'll explore in the next slide. One way to think about the impacts from the pandemic on the seafood sector is to think in terms of supply chains and look for evidence of shocks or disruptions along the supply chain. And that's what you'll see in this image. In fact, in the beginning of the pandemic, we saw disruptions to multiple stages of the supply chain at once. And this happened across subsectors, scales, and geographies. Because seafood is internationally traded, impacts in one country can cause ripple effects in other countries, like a pulse wave that travels up or down a supply chain. Shocks can also cause lagged impacts, such as a drop in demand, leaving a farmer to not restock their ponds after harvesting, which may affect supply and livelihoods. As the pandemic spreads and reemerges, it creates a patchwork of impacts and responses. And this is a complex story. It's nuanced and it changes over time. Next, I'll walk through some impacts that we've seen to different stages of the supply chain. The first impacts from the pandemic were on consumer demand. As you know, outbreaks led to lockdowns, which reduced the mobility and spending power of consumers. This photo is of a fish market in Bangladesh, which shows vendors and shoppers wearing masks and practicing social distancing. Many things that you are probably doing in your own lives. This slide shows some of the first evidence we saw of demand disruptions coming out of China. These data are Chinese wholesale fish sales at 147 markets around the country. In red are fish species typically sold to retail, and in blue are fish species typically sold to restaurants. You can see in February and March, both sales to restaurants and retail were down sharply. However, in April and beyond, fish species sold to retail rebounded and were above pre-pandemic levels, while sales to restaurants were still below pre-pandemic levels. This is similar to what we've seen in other countries, where consumers have shifted away from eating at restaurants and more to eating at home, due to public health measures to reduce the spread of the virus. The pandemic also disrupted seafood distribution. Lockdowns closed ports for cargo ships and slowed the movement of frozen seafood. Fresh seafood often travels by air, and reduced international passenger flights have caused logistical problems and increased air freight costs. Some distributors have been able to shift trade from one market to another, showing how global trade can buffer the effects of the pandemic. This seems to work well for high-value markets and places without major disease outbreaks. However, trade can also expose vulnerabilities in our food system, particularly for low and middle income countries, if trade is disrupted to those places. Labor and livelihoods have also been disrupted by the pandemic. The lockdowns disrupted the movement of workers and the ability of businesses to access labor. Early in the pandemic, migrant fish workers weren't able to leave fishing boats in India or the South Pacific or ports in Thailand, and closures of fish markets rendered many workers jobless. In low-income countries, farms and businesses in food supply chains provide self-employment and casual work for many people. COVID-19 policies have impacted the operations of businesses and resulted in lowered incomes and substantial unemployment. Lower income can lead to food insecurity and other health disparities. We've also seen disease outbreaks at fish processing plants in Ghana, the United States, and elsewhere. The pandemic has also affected seafood production. Lockdowns have decreased industrial fishing activity by 40 to even greater than 50% in countries like China, Spain, France, and Italy in the first quarter of 2020 compared to 2019. Aquaculture production has been disrupted as farmers wonder whether they should restock given uncertainty over demand. And this is an example of a lagged effect I mentioned earlier. For example, in early 2020, shrimp farmers in Southeast Asia stopped stocking ponds, in some cases due to difficulty importing broodstock, in other cases because demand was down. I'm curious to hear from our panelists what the situation is like today. In the last few slides, I've talked about disruptions and framed that within the stages of the supply chain. Next, I want to give you a framework for how groups respond to these shocks. The first step is often simply to absorb the shock, react to what's happening, and try to restore basic system functions. For example, if you're a business, to keep your business running, keep the lights on, and pay your employees. Next is what we're seeing today, and we'll be seeing more and more of, is that people and groups are beginning a learning process so they can develop and deploy longer-term adaptive responses and preventative actions, and hopefully arrive at a different point than where they started this pandemic, where they are more resilient and able to face this and other shocks and ongoing stressors like climate change. I want to share a few examples that build off the previous slide. Early reactive actions we saw by governments were principally to protect the food supply and workers. Several countries designated fishers, fish farmers, and fish processors as essential workers, which allowed them to work during lockdowns. Governments and industry also acted to protect the health of those workers. However, we've seen that's not always been so easy. We still see outbreaks on vessels and at processing plants. In terms of longer-term adaptive measures, those have often emerged outside of government. A few examples: small-scale fisher networks in India and South Africa have mobilized to share information, document impacts, and advocate for government resources. Producer organizations have bought back fish from their members. We've also seen fishers use food banks and food sharing to distribute their catch. And direct marketing has become a lot more popular among fishers. We'll hear more from our panelists with other examples that are going on today. Returning to business as usual following the pandemic would be a missed opportunity to fix the parts of the food system and the seafood sector that were not working even before the pandemic, whether that's environmental sustainability, nutrition security, or social equity. This figure shows how food systems changes are driven by our shared values. Thinking about justice, thriving local economies, sustainable ecosystems, and healthy people. These are things we can all strive for. I hope this talk gives you a good background and framework for thinking about the impacts, responses, and lessons learned during the pandemic, and a jumping off point for the rest of the seminar. This pandemic is affecting so many people in so many different ways. We've collected video clips from people who work in the seafood sector around the world, and we've compiled that into a mashup video so you can hear their words and their stories and how they're dealing with the pandemic.
আমাদের হইলো মাছের বাজার কম, আমরা এই জন্য মাছগুলো বিক্রি করতে পারতেছি না, কিন্তু মাছের খাওয়া দিন করে কর্তা করে হইলেও খাওয়ান লাগতেছে, এই জন্য মাছের এই যে খাবারের চাহিদাটা বেশি। বাজারে মাছের কম, বাজারে এখন লোকজন কম, ওই যে করোনা ভাইরাসের লেগে অনেকে বাজারে যায় না, মানুষ কম বাজারে। তারপরে ইলিশ আছে, কিছু গুড়া মাছ কিছু কিছু নামতাছে,
বিলের মাছও প্রচুর আছে,
বিলের মাছ পানি হয়েছে, বিলের মাছ এই জন্য লোক খুব কম, ভাইরাসের লেগে অনেক মানুষ যায় না।
Hello everybody, I'm a manager of Nam Hai Shrimp Hatchery Enterprise. My company reduce input cost, labor cost, and maintain producing shrimp lava. We organize training course about COVID-19 for workers to improve their awareness. We also find a new activity to get more income. We implement e-commerce service between hatchery and customer.
মোটামুটি ভালো কামাই করছি।
আগে ডেলি কত কামাইছেন?
আগে মনে করুন যে 500-900, ওই 500, 600, 700, 400। এখন মনে করুন যে ওই 200, 250, 300, 400 এরকম।
ডেলি হয়
না, ডেলি হয় না।
আগে ডেলি হইতো,
আগে ডেলি কম বেশ হইতো।
Not only, but seafood typically isn't a takeout type venue. Normally it's a sit-down, nice experience, and so a lot of your restaurants, seafood restaurants, just aren't able to accommodate that.
আগে যে খরচটা ছিল এখন কিন্তু খরচ নাই, কিন্তু আমাদের ইনকাম খুব কম, আমাদের সংকটে আছে।
Hi, my name is Tuấn Ngô from Quoc Việt Seafood in Vietnam. The COVID-19 has affected our business positively. Our export increased 11% during the last 12 months because the demand of our shrimp products increased globally. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ed Lee Wilson, Head of Aquaculture here at Aquascot's, an employee-owned fish processing business here in the Scottish Highlands. Our orders went through the roof, due mainly to panic buying and the collapse of the food service market. We therefore brought forward investments in plant and machinery, which we planned for later in the year, and that helped us manage the extra load. Our factory partners stepped into a difficult working environment with masks and social distancing. Visits, including all on-site audits, were cancelled, and biosecurity measures, already a key part of running any fish farm operation, were enhanced. The farming process, though, had to keep going, so feed needed delivered, vets had to visit, fish to care for, etc. Results have been extremely positive, enhanced customer service levels, and improved yield due to increased volume, of course, throughout.
Hello, and greetings from the Association of Genuine Alaska Pollock Producers. On the demand end, Wild Alaska Pollock has been very fortunate to have strong penetration into both the retail frozen food category and the core menu portion of the quick service restaurant category. As we all know, these have been two of the strongest channels during the COVID-19 pandemic. As such, Wild Alaska Pollock was positioned very well and better than most seafoods. We are working diligently now to expand our product placement in as many channels as possible.
Well, thanks to everyone for those contributions. And well, I hope that's given everyone a bit of a background to what's been happening in the seafood sector around the world. We are taping this webinar, and it will be available through a link we give to you later. But now, briefly to introduce your panel, Ben Belton is a senior scientist at WorldFish and an assistant professor at Michigan State University. Sarah Benhamou is Deputy Commercial Director of Victory Farms in Kenya. Jingji Chu is Senior Natural Resource Economist at the Global Program of Fisheries and Aquaculture at the World Bank. Jessica Fanzo is Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Global Food and Agricultural Policy and Ethics at Johns Hopkins University. And Sarah Lindley Smith is a postdoctoral research associate at the Department of Human Ecology, Rutgers University. Joshua Stoll supporting your interaction by fielding the online questions and is an assistant professor of marine policy, the School of Marine Sciences at the University of Maine. So first, perhaps an opening question to you, Jess Fanzo, perhaps to say how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting food systems and more generally, and who's most impacted from a food security, nutrition and health perspective.
Thanks a lot, Dave, for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure to see everyone. So the COVID pandemic is really impacting food system functionality and efficiency in different ways, both positively and negatively. And we're still gathering evidence of the impacts of COVID on global food systems and local food systems. But we know that government-led mechanisms, curfews, lockdowns, strains on trade have and all of this is to stop the spread of the virus, along with the economic downturn, have really impacted people who are working in food and consumers. So we've seen decreased agriculture production capacity, slowed food distribution with impacts of food crossing borders and ports, meat processing plant COVID outbreaks, and limited access to food safety nets, fresh foods, and markets. The who is really important here, and Dave Love's presentation at the beginning really showed not only the impacts on the entire seafood sector, but who's affected. We know among food system actors, particularly those who depend on wages coming from seasonal labor impacted. Many women who work post-farm gate are impacted in their ability to be able to sell their food, be able to participate in the processing and packaging of food. But then we think about population health overall, we know that there's modeling, and we're starting to see the signs of those models come true, that those who are already undernourished will face further declines and worsening of health. particularly the elderly, the nutritionally vulnerable, and the marginalized. We also know that obesity and non-communicable diseases are significant risk factors of COVID hospitalizations and complex medical complications. And we see that obesity increases risks of hospitalization and death disproportionately among low-income and ethnic minority populations. So we're seeing multiplier effects of not only food system functioning, but those who are working in or depend on, which is all of us, the food system. And the seafood sector really shows those examples in a very clear way.
Thanks, Jess. Maybe Jingji, could you add anything to that briefly?
Yeah, I think one, seafood is has a lot of common characteristic as other food, but also seafood has its own characteristic. For example, it's more perishable. So it really depends on whether the country has a very sophisticated cold chain logistic system and also more innovative way to sell their seafood product. And I noticed there is one interesting impact related to the seafood is in China. Because it's a COVID situation, before Chinese really like imported seafood because they believe they are safer. So the demand was very high. However, after the COVID and they have been testing the different seafood product from, like aquaculture, Chile, Russian, Indonesia, they find the COVID in the packaging. So then that really drive the demand for imported seafood, decline. So that's a very interesting phenomenon compared to other countries.
Yeah, Thanks. yes, indeed. That's fascinating. And I wonder if perhaps you could further talk maybe a little about the disruptions and impacts that you've been observing in the West African fisheries and aquaculture sectors.
Yes, I think for Africa, those are West Africa, particularly one of the poorest countries in the world. They really struggling to make a living, particularly for the artisanal fishermen. One hand, because the import of food product were banned, so in those countries, their demand for seafood as a major protein really increased and the price increased. But the fishermen couldn't take the advantage of that because the national curfew. They couldn't go out fishing from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. And as you know, that's a pretty lively time for a lot of artisanal fishermen. So they couldn't do that. And then on the other hand, because of the curfew, the fish traders, they couldn't travel between communities. So that also affected the seafood selling. This distribution channel got interrupted. And then the third, sometimes the government is really lack of, I would say, consideration, understanding, and recognition that the seafood is a major protein supply sector. Therefore, they should be regarded as an essential sector. And there should be more flexible policies to support the fishermen and fishmongers and then to support the input supply channels. But that was not the case. So what happened in West Africa is, one, they had a limited seafood supply, and then two, they couldn't get a required input, and then the fuel price also increased. So they really get a much worse situation in those countries. And then I was thinking the only positive impact is the foreign trawlers has been declined. But that's not only because of COVID, but also because of license fee and also stricter monitoring and control surveillance measures in place. However, the only closed season in April was postponed for industry trawlers. So the only benefit the local fishermen want to see, they couldn't. And then so in those countries, I really feel their government has to be a little bit more flexible, and it really has to balance the trade-off between the COVID treatment and the essential food supply. Baseline is their situation is worse than before.
Thank you, Jingji. Perhaps we can move to Sarah Benholm now and ask the question about how fisheries and aquaculture sectors have been faring on the eastern side of Africa in Lake Victoria, where your farm is, and perhaps specifically talk to how it's impacted on the commercial activities in your farm. Sarah.
Hi, Dave, thank you for that question. I think that similar issues were reported in East Africa as also in West Africa. And I think for Victory Farms, we have been very, very fortunate to record growth in the year 2020 with all the challenges that came about. Some of that can be associated with the fact that we acted very quickly after looking at what was happening in the European markets with the COVID effects, and we made sure that things like feed that would be affected with border closures were brought into the country a bit earlier. That gave us a head start into that. And I think that one of the things that also has affected our market the way it's affected is the fact that the spread in this side of the world is not as bad as it is in the European side. So in terms of labor, we have been able to continue production because working with the health ministry, we have applied safety measures that ensures that the staff can still report to work in a safe environment. We have also minimized external parties from coming to our production sites and our main offices. We have moved some of our staff to working remotely just to make sure that we have a good enough support system for our essential workers. And again, worked very closely with the government to get the proper permitting to allow movement. So then cessation of movement was not really a big issue for us. Unfortunately for the fishermen, that has had a very negative impact on them because they operate at night. And as you know, Kenya currently has a curfew that takes effect from 10 p.m. and only opens up at 4 a.m. Those are the times that fishermen normally go out. So we've had a lot of people come to look for work in our company, and the growth has really helped that community because we're able to take in a lot more people that initially were relying on fishing, but now they can come in and work in Victory Farms. So we have been fortunate, but we're continuing to work with the community and see how we can continue to support the fishermen because we are essentially in a fishing community.
That's interesting and good to hear. Perhaps we could turn now to the northeast of the US and ask Sarah Smith, from your work there, what sort of disruptions and impacts have you been seeing?
Sure. So my research has been specifically on the commercial fishing industry and commercial fishermen. And somewhat different to Africa, there were no real restrictions on fishing activity, even during the early months of the pandemic, even during the shutdown that we had here back in the spring. Fishing was considered an essential activity. So we didn't see those types of disruptions. So the majority of the impacts that we have seen have really been economic in nature, both as a result of a reduction in restaurant sales and significant disruptions to export markets. And we've really seen that disruptions to the commercial fishing industry here have varied, I'd say, pretty widely across the industry, from fishermen who've experienced essentially very little disruption to their livelihoods and their fishing activity to some who've, likely stopped fishing altogether. So here in the United States, about 70% of seafood consumption here occurs in restaurants. So for many fishermen, that makes up a significant portion of their businesses. And, like elsewhere, there's still very limited demand for restaurant dining even now. So back in the spring, we surveyed more than 250 fishermen about how they were affected in the early months of the pandemic, and including whether or not they were still fishing. And we found that while some of them were not fishing at the time and were likely waiting for the uncertainty of the pandemic to subside, the majority of the fishermen who we heard from had continued fishing throughout the start of the pandemic. But we did see that their incomes and their revenues were significantly affected, mainly because prices for species were low kind of across the board. More than 2/3 of the fishermen that we surveyed said that their incomes were down by 20% or more at the beginning, for the first half of the year. And we also found, looking at prices of species across the region, that most prices were down by at least 20 or 30% compared with recent averages, and in some case prices were down much more. We had some fishermen who reported that they were leaving fishing at least for the year, and some of them might choose not to return. But at the same time, now that we're a year into the pandemic, we've been surprised to find that landings for many species in the region have remained more or less on track with previous years. And we've seen that a lot of fishermen in the region are fishing, probably fishing just as hard as they normally do. They're just making a lot less money because of the low prices. And in some cases where they're able to, fishermen are fishing even harder to try to make up some of those revenue gaps. But we've seen that the impacts to fishermen really differ substantially by the fisheries that they're involved in. So fishermen who are fishing for species that translate better to retail sales, like some whitefish species, the prices for them have rebounded somewhat since the start of the pandemic. But fishermen targeting species for which a significant portion of their catch is either exported or relies on restaurant sales, such as lobster, for example, in our region, they've been hit much harder. So I think, overall, the takeaway message is that there's considerable uncertainty within the fishery for what the future holds. And that uncertainty, I think, is likely to persist for quite some time.
Thanks, Sarah. Wow, lots of impacts of different types. Perhaps we can move to Ben Belton now and perhaps ask Ben, what disruptions and impacts has World Fish uncovered in its multi-country survey that has really been going on for a large part of 2020? Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Dave. So World Fish, as you said, ran a survey covering most of 2020 on a monthly basis. And this was in Myanmar, Bangladesh, India, Egypt, and Nigeria, with actors throughout the fish value chain. And actually quite a lot of the impacts are quite similar to the ones that Sarah's been describing, interestingly. So I can kind of group them into the four big effects. The first one most immediately was that COVID-19 and the containment measures in March and sort of March to May, when they were particularly stringent, really severely disrupted aquatic food value chains. So due to transport movement restrictions, restrictions on people moving, market closures, business closures, and so on. But those effects on the supply of food were really quite short-lived. But what we see is that demand for aquatic foods has been much slower to recover to pre-pandemic levels, and in many cases hasn't recovered fully. And as a result, demand for production inputs, for labor, for services that are used by all of the businesses up the chain has also been lower. So the incomes for those businesses and for their workers has been much lower in 2019 compared to 2020. So with the sort of supply shock in March through May, we saw a brief spike in retail prices for fish and other aquatic foods. But since then, as demand has been low, the prices have really trended steadily down in almost all of the countries, in fact. At the same time, prices for feeds and some other inputs have risen somewhat. That's sort of associated with increased costs of doing business, and also I think inflation, which has been really quite high in most of these countries this year. And so that suggests that producers and other actors in the value chain may be sort of increasingly squeezed even after they've survived this initial shock at the start of the year.
Wow, thanks, man. I'd like you to perhaps to talk also to how you see institutions and seafood-related businesses sort of adapting to the pandemic going forward, perhaps in a short term. Do you see short term, or are there, is there evidence of longer term adaptations coming out?
Yeah, we see a lot of sort of short to medium term kind of reactive adaptations, some of which, definitely sort of necessary for survival, but maybe kind of maladaptations that might sort of undermine longer term resilience perhaps. And so, I mean, really across the board, we see businesses trying to reduce production costs. So for instance, hiring fewer workers, delaying stocking ponds, as we've heard, and trying to source cheaper inputs, for instance. And we also see really a lot of sort of dependence on leveraging social capital through informal networks. And so this is important both for large businesses and sort of small businesses and actors. So kind of using that in order to sort of borrow money that will help them sort of smooth consumption. And this is really because there's very little formal assistance, but also larger businesses making sort of use of their political power, for instance, to get around some restrictions. We see particularly smaller actors sort of diversifying, seeking alternative employment because they're unable to make enough money doing their usual work. And then we see quite frequently sort of reducing food consumption as well, so fewer meals or lower quality foods. And so these kind of actions really necessary to survive in the short term, but definitely undermining the immediate sort of well-being. Larger businesses tend to have more adaptive capacity and the opportunity to be sort of more proactive, as we've heard in the video and some of the earlier comments. So, and it's possible that at least in some value chain segments, in some places, those advantages will sort of continue to grow if the crisis continues, and that might eventually lead to some kind of concentration in some segments.
Thanks, Ben. Sarah Benhamou, perhaps you could talk to the sort of adaptations you've seen that Victory Farms have been able to make.
So on this part of the world, what we have actually seen is a lot of digitalization of businesses. Initially, fish trading in Kenya is a very informal kind of a business. We operate in low-income neighborhoods with partners who are not necessarily on social media, but as a part of reaching the customer who's probably stuck at home and cannot be able to move around, we've seen a lot of people putting up delivery services, our partners going into delivery services, partnering with Uber Eats to be able to take the product from point A to point B without necessarily requiring the person to move around. Most of those companies were permitted to move around even during curfew hours. So that channel has really exploded compared to how it was performing before. We've also seen a very big sprout of fishmongers. A lot of the people in the civil service were halted from working because schools were closed. And what we've actually been tracking is the number of people in banking industry, teachers who have resulted to coming into the fish industry where they're coming and buying fish from Victory Farms and then starting their businesses either online or from the house. And we associate that with some of the growth that we saw because we were able to see a very high growth in the number of customers that we had. And I think that the other maybe difference, just listening to Ben on this side, because schools were not open, it meant that for an entire year, the market has been focused on looking at fish as a luxury item that they could now afford because they were not spending money on school fees. It means that food became the priority in many households. And so we saw our sales go up because now people could afford to buy fish. And most of the families have kids who are in boarding schools who all of a sudden were sent home. So the basket size grew again. If they were feeding 2 people initially, a mom and a dad, now they were actually feeding 2 kids who had been in school before. In terms of institutions like restaurants, some of them have closed, which is really sad. The ones that are still operational are operating at, I would say, 30% projected revenue pre-COVID. The Kenyan government has issued a go back to work kit, which helps businesses know what kind of measures they need to apply to be able to open up for operations. That is social distancing, making sure that there is hand sanitization when people are coming in, and takeaway menus and takeaway services have improved. So I would say that looking at the Kenyan market especially, in a year or so, it feels like the industry is trying to coexist with COVID, and we have come to recognize that we don't have a time frame for when COVID is going to be completely out of our lives. And so basically businesses and people are trying to figure out how to continue with their daily lives while staying safe.
Thanks, Sarah. Perhaps turn back to Jinji just for an example of where you're seeing the greatest signs of resilience in these seafood value chains.
Yes, thank you, Dave, for the question. I think I can see when the government has very strong control in place, that sort of help. For example, China had a very strong border control. Not only that, even within the community, you almost feel people are watching each other to see if you have relatives coming from abroad, then you have to stay at home, things like that. And also China does have very strong, implementation ability. I think that's the only country they can test a few million people within 3 days just to make sure this city has not been exposed as to many COVID situation. And the second key element is the maturity of the e-commerce. I think this pandemic really almost make every single country to realize the importance of e-commerce. And again, I think China is ahead of many countries because one, it has a very sophisticated infrastructure, from the faster speed train to local transportation. And also there is a big advantage in China because everyone is using Facebook or WhatsApp in other countries, and those were forbidden in China, but we had WeChat, and that has over 1 billion users actively on a daily basis. So all of these people, almost 80% of them had some kind of purchasing experience online directly. They all use Alipay or WeChat Pay. So that's the popularity of this e-wallet, which make this e-commerce much faster to reach to people and really help the resilience among the consumers. So they could just do that. And then third, I would say is the innovative marketing way. So again, in China, they have a lot of this live stream type of marketing. It's almost like the TV selling, but you have this live streamer, we call it shopping guide or influencer, who can sell millions of dollars product in one day because they have a lot of fans following them. And one lady, I think, sold $385 million product in one day. So that person is more than many other bigger companies. So things like that really help the sector. And I find one fishing village in China, they have over 200 live streamers, from fishermen to fish traders to their children. So they can sell their product from the boat or the nearby processing facility directly. So this popularity really help the country and the sector to be more resilient. Thanks.
Thanks, Jinji. Wow, that's fascinating. Perhaps Sarah Smith, what about on the northeast of the US?
Sure. Well, we've seen a few different ways in which fishermen are being resilient to the impacts of the pandemic. But I think, primarily the way that they're demonstrating their resilience is really just by sort of continuing fishing as much as possible and trying to sort of maintain the fishing industry during these challenging times. We've seen, prices are still down now, and fishermen's revenues are still being affected, but a lot of them are adopting the strategy of really just trying to stay in the game fishing until restaurants reopen at full capacity and demand is back and prices rebound. One of the ways that we've seen them doing that is, for those fishermen who are able to, who are sort of diversified in their gear or their permits, that they're switching among different species. So we've seen, fishermen switching to targeting species that are either more interest to home cooks and retail, or that do better as in the frozen market. So we've seen, quite a bit of species switching among fishermen. And we've seen generally that, a lot of fishermen are just concerned with trying to pay their crew make their boat payments, and then keep the processors and shoreside support businesses operating until the pandemic has subsided. So I think there's a real interest in just trying to, keep going and treating this pandemic really just as another economic challenge to overcome. So just trying to continue fishing and, keep the fishery active until the situation improves.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. We're going to move now into the open question, and we've had lots of great questions coming up on the chat. And I wondered if I could address this question to Ben, first of all. Is there a specific methodologies you've been using to identify the effects of COVID on global seafood supply chains? Ben, could you talk to that?
Yeah, I think like a lot of other people who've been doing research on this, when the crisis hit, there was this sort of immediate need to find out what was happening, and so having to field surveys very rapidly, and the only way to do that really being remotely, so phone surveys, and so we've taken this approach where we've implemented a panel survey to track what's happening over time, because of the need to sort of start the survey immediately, and that it's not being possible to get out in the field and identify respondents. Then that has to be a kind of an opportunistic approach. So, relying on previous contacts, and so it's not a very representative sample, but it does at least give you a sort of understanding of the direction that things are going in. So I think I'll just stop there for a minute.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I wonder if I could ask Dave Love to talk to the question, is there a binary divide between wild capture and cultivated fish in aquatic?
Yeah, Dave, that's a great question. It's easy to kind of want to split things out into one or the other, us versus them sometimes for the aquaculture and fisheries industry. I really don't see a divide here. This is a challenge that's facing all of us. And, throughout the talk, I've just been taking some notes, and, I see shared concerns about people, about livelihoods. We're all part of this conversation together today, and hopefully we'll continue to be. And, what it sounds like is we're all on the learning curve together. So what solutions for fisheries and aquaculture might be same, might be different in some cases, but we're all part of the same value chain. And so to really keep this conversation going, and to note that these are big problems, and they're going to change over time, and the solutions might change as well. So
good. Thank you, David. Perhaps I can ask someone in the panel to respond to the question about increased demands being reported from Vietnam to Scotland, in fact, and do speakers expect that to continue post-COVID? And if so, how can it be sort of built into the business models of the companies who are able to do this? Anyone answer that on our panel?
I can try, Dave.
Please, Jinji.
Yes, I think, from China, as I mentioned, the domestic demand of seafood has increased, but the demand for imported seafood has declined just because the concern or the fear of the imported coronavirus on the packaging system. So I think one big retailer called JD.com, Jingdong, they have developed their ways to bring more confidence to consumers. They have a certificate. They test every single product and make sure before that goes to consumer, it has this certificate, either it's imported or domestic, to say this is COVID free. So, any business like that, which can help bring confidence to consumers, and then they can maintain or increase their demand. And you can see this particular one, I think their demand has increased over 20% after they have all these warranty policies in place. But again, for the other countries, they really have to learn and understand what the consumers' concerns are. Is it really about the price? Because in China, that's not because of price. They rather pay more for imported product, but not after they suspect there will be a COVID situation. Thanks.
Thanks, Jimmy. Jess, I wonder if you could answer the question about, are there some lessons from other food sectors or government responses that the seafood sector should hear about?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Dave had said, you know, we're learning here, but I think there's 4 big lessons that are emerging across food systems and seafood's, of course, critically important for this. One, there's a case to make for ensuring our food supply is safe, nutritious, and food is equitably distributed during COVID and long after. And seafood is obviously central to that. And food policies need to really ensure access to healthy diets, and seafood is a top priority. And that means safety nets, food assistance. It means changing the choice architecture of food environments to ensure seafood is affordable and available, and that there's economic incentives for consumers to purchase seafood. And of course, there's food price policies that are critically important to ensure that staples remain low so consumers can afford some of these more luxury foods like seafood. The second lesson that we're learning is that we absolutely need to prioritize protecting food supply workers along seafood supply chains, as well as every food supply chain. They've been undervalued and undermined, and many have gotten ill, and that's a huge priority. The third is mitigating trade bans. I mean, fish is one of the most traded food products in the world, and we need to ensure that trade keeps flowing, and global cooperation around trade. And then last, on the cooperation side, ensuring that food systems function effectively during the pandemic and again long after. Nothing will really hold if we have this splintered global governing response that we've seen with COVID. Governments have really faced inward, and this even includes the distribution of the vaccine, which is incredibly important when we think about the food supply and those that are working in it. So the political environment needs to be one that embraces global cooperation, multilateral cooperation and inclusion, and minimizes political polarization and geopolitical competition. And these are big issues, but they are really showing through when we think about the global food system and the cooperation within it to ensure that it's functional, fair, and effective.
Thank you, Jess. That's pretty comprehensive. And with that, I'm going to move to some closing remarks by Andrew Thorne-Lyman, also of Johns Hopkins. And over to you, Andrew, for some summary remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Dave. So I think Jess actually did a wonderful job sort of summarizing, with those words, the food system being functional, fair, and effective. I mean, that's the goal here. If there's one thing that I sort of took away from the video segment, it's that this is incredibly complex. Some producers are being affected in a positive way, saying that their business has gotten better, but many are being adversely affected. And I think that in many ways sort of represents the complexity of seafood. And I think in many ways it's sort of a microcosm for the global food system. As Jess said, it's the most traded commodity globally in terms of the value. And being a global commodity, when shocks such as COVID-19 happen, I mean, it sends ripples throughout the world, and these ripples are unpredictable. And they're further influenced by the way that governments have handled it. And I think one of the things that we didn't talk too much about was consumers and sort of how this is affecting their nutrition security. And I think it's important to really think about equity. This pandemic has really shown a light on how inequitable some aspects of the food system are, and fish and seafood represent for many consumers the most important source of things like micronutrients and fatty acids, and these are really essential for human nutrition. The CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, said that for his business and for some of these businesses, like over 6 months, they had seen sort of this change that normally would only be seen in 5 years. And I think for local producers that have been agile have been rewarded here. And just hearing about, even in Kenya, a lot of movement towards Uber Eats and delivery. I think that's just fascinating. I think in many ways, what we're seeing, some of these changes that have happened are going to be permanent, and it'll be really interesting to see after the pandemic fades, what are going to be the long-term implications here for the seafood system. So thank you. Those are some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Yes, well, we've seen some of that diversity today. We've been reminded that the sector's very diverse. These value chains are often sometimes very short, sometimes very long. People have been affected by whatever place they have in those value chains, whether they're a consumer all the way up to an input supplier, and how these impacts ratchet along. I'd really like to thank Dave Love for leading this seminar with his excellent 10-minute presentation, and of course all of the panel members that have taken part in this, what I think is a fruitful and timely discussion. Also the contributors of the video material, and if you'd like to contribute to the coming series, we'd love to have a little video message from you as well. These seminars will be posted in the coming weeks, and we expect to have another 2 or 3 in this season. And that allows us really to reach out and we hope tell something of the story more globally. But we'd like to thank you as participants and contributors through your chat questions during today's session. And for those of you who chose to participate virtually in our deep dive today, many, many thanks for that. We hope you've been inspired and taken something useful from this discussion that you can apply to your everyday work, research, individual or collective action for shaping positive change in the world through fish and aquatic foods. We hope that this downloadable 1-hour presentation can be useful in communicating and teaching other people. This seminar will be made available as a recording to all registered attendees, and also we'll pass on details of the next and the coming up and coming Big Fish series seminars. With that, have a great day. Stay safe and healthy. Our 1 hour is up. Thank you very much and see you again next time.